everybody, it's Tanisha, also known as Crafty of Crafty Creations, and I am here to do the tutorial for the 4-piece Grinch rolling tray set that I listed on my Facebook page, and a lot of folks wanted to know how I made this thing. And I am doing the tutorial to show you all how to complete not only the tray, which is just like my other tutorials as far as the tray, how it is put together using Cricut vinyl, how to do the airtight jar, and those are things you can do with just the basic Dollar Tree tray and just a little jar. But in this video, we're also going to pour an ashtray to complete the Grinch ashtray, and we're also going to pour a resin grinder. Okay, so gathering your materials, you're also going to need epoxy. This is a 32-ounce container. There's 16 of hardener, 16 of resin. That's what I would recommend for this project, especially if you're not real familiar with pouring epoxy. You might make a few mistakes and need some extra. So gathering those items, let's get started. I thought it would be a good idea to break this tutorial down into kind of two parts. The first part of this, and I'll be sure and put timestamps in the description once it's complete. So check down there in the description if you'd like to know what parts of the video are at what times. But I'm going to do the tray and the jar in the first part, which is what you can make without any knowledge of major epoxy pouring or having molds or anything like that. And then in the second part, I'm going to pour the ashtray and the grinder, which you do need special molds in order to complete. The very first thing that we need to do is paint the tray from Dollar Tree, and for this 4-piece set, the little metal lid that we will be using for the herb jar. The paint that I recommend, as I've said before in other tutorials, as well as having demonstrated how to actually paint this, is this Rust-Oleum 2x brand paint plus primer. You can see the color that I used to get the Grinch color is High Gloss Tropical Leaf. The easiest way to get the measurements for you to know how to cut your vinyl in Cricut Design Space, or if you're using a silhouette, however you decide to cut your vinyl, the easiest thing I find is just to measure what I'm using. Since the Grinch is going to go, and you can see how the mouth here kind of goes up the edges. You might want yours more in the center. You might want it all the way to the edge. It depends on how you want placement on this tray, how you measure how wide to go across. If you want his face to go from the edge of the tray to the edge of the tray, then you measure from the edge of the tray to the edge of the tray, which is 10 inches. And you know you have a 10 by 10 inch window to work with in Design Space. I would like mine on this tray to be a little more on the inside than I did on this one. So I'm gonna go just a little bit smaller so that my Grinch face sits right inside of this circle, okay? So right inside the circle, it is approximately 7 3/4 inches across, all right? 7 3/4 inches across. No, not 3/4. A little less than 7 1/2, actually. I'm gonna go with probably a 7 1/4 inch window just to make sure that I can fit it all in when I go into Cricut Design Space, and we'll figure out what size his face is gonna be. And then this little lid, is 1.5 inches across. So that lets you know about how big of a design you need to have, no bigger than 1 1/2 inches on your face here, okay? So we're gonna go over to Cricut Design Space and cut out all of these pieces, and I'm gonna show you how to put this on. So in my Cricut Design Space, I'm gonna take the image that I'm gonna use, and this is where I'm gonna determine what size my Grinch face needs to be. And since I decided that he was on the plate needed to be about 7 1/4 was the space I was working in, then I changed my dimensions accordingly and shrink this down to the size that I need. I made this 7 inches by 6.5 here, okay? And that's what I'm going to cut out in my Cricut. Now, each piece requires a different size Grinch. You're gonna change this for each piece, for each component. Now, if it's easier, measure all 4 and cut all 4 at once. For the sake of the tutorial, I'm going to go one at a time so that you can see what it is that I'm doing. So here is the Grinch for the tray at 7 by 6.5, and I'm going to print this, cut this out, and then I'm going to do it again in 1.5 inches, and then we're going to apply these to the tray and the lid.
Graphics out of our vinyl on the Cricut machine, I'm going to go through a process of weeding and removing the excess vinyl. I apply in layers to clear contact paper, and then I apply it to my tray. Now, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a tutorial on how to use a Cricut machine. And if that's something we need to work on, I can absolutely do that, but this isn't it, okay? So you definitely have to know how to use your Cricut, how to layer in order to complete this Grinch tray, okay? So I'm going to get busy weeding my vinyl, okay, and peeling it all apart. This is basically what weeding is. You take the vinyl, excess vinyl, off, so that you get down to just the pieces that you want to apply. So I'm going to work on that, apply the larger graphic to the tray, and apply the other tiny little graphic to the lid.
One of the things you must make certain of, just like on any other rolling tray, is that your vinyl is flush to your tray. You need to smooth this down, and I actually should probably use a squeegee, and make certain that this is firm to the tray. You do not want epoxy to get under this vinyl. The reason I'm keeping the clear on is just so that I can rub it without messing up the vinyl at all, because it's protected, okay? And then when I peel this off, slowly, so that just in case the vinyl's not all the way stuck down, we don't rip it back up. Okay, and there is the first part, the tray itself. This will get coated with epoxy. That's it, folks. That's the Grinch tray. Cricut vinyl on a green tray. We're going to cover this with epoxy. We're going to do the same process on this green lid with the other little pieces of vinyl. Now, I will tell you, when I made the original set, I could not get those little white dots of vinyl on here. So I just took a toothpick and 2 little dots of white paint in my Grinch's eyes, which is what I'm going to do again. All that I'm actually cutting out of this next set is just the black face and the yellow eyes. Okay, now we've got the face on our painted tray, and I did do this one a little bit smaller than the original because I wanted it right in the center instead of coming up on the edges. So this I did just a little bit smaller. And then the lid, I also did the little dots in the eye with a toothpick and a little bit of white paint because I could not get that tiny little piece of vinyl in the right spot. So that's how I finished off that. The only thing we need to do at this point on these items, folks, is put our little coat of epoxy on this. And I use the triple thick spray glaze. It's actually epoxy also in the 2x brand, just like my paint, and paint this lid. So following the tutorials that I have previously released, we're going to mix our epoxy and we are going to pour onto this tray. And then we're going to put it over on the table that I have a level on so that we make certain that this is stable. Now, one of the things I want to tell you, I use triple thick or spray epoxy on this little lid, but I use Envirotex Light or Alumilite for my trays. Both of these products can be found in Michael's, Hobby Lobby, craft stores, okay? I recommend getting a 32-ounce box for this project. But I say that to say, when we do the ashtray, we also will use initially for the first pour clear resin, just like we will coat the tray with. As you can see, only the bottom half of this ashtray is actually green. This is actually clear at the top. Just the bottom half is green, okay? So one thing you may want to do while you're preparing the pour for the epoxy on this tray is go ahead and get your mold ready so that when we mix the clear for this tray, which takes about 2 ounces of epoxy, we can go ahead and pour the first part of our ashtray mold, which is going to take, as I measure, about 100 milliliters for this clear part to fit in this tray, okay? So let's get our epoxy gathered and we'll go ahead and get ready to do this pour in 2 ounces and this ashtray pour 100 milliliters. The products that I recommend for covering the lid of that little jar, if you use it or do it the same way that I have with the vinyl, is either this 2x clear, this is a spray acrylic, or the triple thick glaze. I've chosen to use the triple thick glaze to cover this because I want to make sure that all of this vinyl is thoroughly covered. And this is a little bit thicker, does take a little bit longer to dry, and that's what I use to cover the lid. And I spray the sides also. Okay, and we're just going to let that sit and dry. Okay, we are going to do the epoxy on our tray now. Now, as I stated, because we're pouring clear epoxy on this tray, we're also going to use clear epoxy on the ashtray. I recommend that you do those at the same time so this can dry as well as this can dry, because this is going to need a second step as well as the step for the grinder, okay? So for the tray, as you may remember in previous tutorials, I recommend anywhere from 2 to 3 ounces of your hardener and resin combined. So what that would be is 1.5 ounces of hardener and 1.5 ounces of resin. Your measurements must be precise, okay? I like to use these little measured disposable measurement cups, okay? And you will put 1.5 ounces of hardener, 1.5 ounces of resin, which is 15 milliliters of hardener, 15 milliliters of resin. That is for the tray. When you get ready to do your ashtray mold, for this particular mold, these are the ones I got from wish.com. This is a 4-inch circle ashtray. I used 100 milliliters of resin, which is 50 of the resin and 50 of the hardener for a total of 100. So when you hear me say I use 10 milliliters of epoxy, that is 5 milliliters of each. If I say 150 of each. So for this tray, I recommend anywhere from 2 to 3 ounces, or 2 to 3, I guess that is 20 to 30 milliliters. So you would put 1.5 or 15 milliliters of hardener, 15 milliliters of resin to complete this, and then you do 50 and 50 to complete the ashtray. So I'm going to go ahead and get my gloves and stuff on and get my epoxy measured up. I'm going to pour this tray first and make sure your vinyl is smoothed down on this so that we can put the epoxy on the top. Okay, so let's get busy working on this epoxy. Always need to wear gloves when you're using resin. For one, it's just really sticky and messy and really hard to get off of stuff. And it is some chemicals and does have a chemical reaction, okay? So you want to make sure you do your measurements precisely, and then we're going to go ahead and pour our tray. Okay, we've got 3 ounces or 30 cc's of our mixed resin. This is both products together, both A and B, in 1 cup. 15 ounces or 15 cc's, 15 cc's, 1.5 makes 30, 3.0. Okay, so here's our tray, and I have mixed. Now, some people like to use heat to get the bubbles out, and that works wonderfully. A blow dryer, one of the creme brulee torches, whatever you use on your other trays is what we're going to use for this. Okay, anything that you use on the other tray is going to work just fine on this one. Now, on the silicone mold, I do not recommend heat, and we'll show you how to get the bubbles out of that one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pour this. Pour this here. And this did take about 3 ounces. The circle trays do require a little bit more resin than the rectangle tray, but you don't want to overfill this or you lose the tray effect. We just want to cover this vinyl. That's all we need to do with this. Okay. Now, one of the things that I am adamant about is my drying table. My drying table over there has a level on it, because if you get these off surface, then your tray dries crooked. I like to use that old school method. It seems to work. I just bang my tray a few times on the concrete floor here in my workshop, and that gets my bubbles out. You can also use heat, a blow dryer. Another thing that I use when I use my silicone mold is isopropyl alcohol. It will also take the bubbles out. Heat will destroy these molds. You keep putting a blow dryer and a creme brulee torch or any kind of flame on this silicone, and you're going to ruin your mold. Okay, you can't do that on silicone. So I just kind of got out of the habit of doing it so that I was certain not to ruin my molds. But I'm going to drop this a couple of more times. Spray with my alcohol. You see those bubbles disappeared. I'm going to drop this a couple of more times on the concrete. And then I am going to put this, okay, see there, bubbles gone. Bubbles gone. I'm going to put this on my drying table right over there, which has got the level on it, so that this dries completely straight and flat. Next, we need to pour our ashtray. So measure out 100 milliliters, 50 of resin, 50 of hardener, and we'll pour the first half of this tray exactly the same way that you mix and pour epoxy to pour it on this tray. As you've learned in previous tutorials, we're going to do the same thing. 50, 50 makes 100. Let's do that. Okay, so with 100 milliliters of clear epoxy, okay, now this is a little bit of a different pour than on a tray. This is a mold, and you have to be very precise. You have to make sure this mold is completely clean. I have a conditioning spray that I use on my molds to keep them from cracking or getting damaged. You definitely have to keep these up. You want to be able to use this mold over and over and over again. And now that I've fiddled with it, it's gotten a little bit dirty. I'm going to rinse this off, and then we're going to pour 100 milliliters right into this, and we're going to put it on the level drying table and leave it for at least 24 hours. This process, this tray process, is going to take you about 3 days, okay? Let me go and rinse this, and let's pour this first half of the ashtray. Well-mixed resin. The reason I said 100 milliliters, that fits this 4-inch mold. It really depends on what kind of mold you have, how much to pour. But what I need to do so that you can understand why I chose 100 milliliters or to measure, you see there's just a little tiny bit of green for the color, and all the rest of this is clear. This clear part is what we're going to pour right now. And you have to make certain that you get over this little hump right here, this little bump, so that this is flat, because we're going to stick a Grinch face on there and then apply the green so that when you flip it over, it looks like this, okay? So take your 100 milliliters, cc's, whatever you want to call it, pour it in your mold, and you have to make certain on this circle tray that the dome is covered, but you don't want to go so far that you don't leave room for the green undertone, or of course then it doesn't look like a Grinch. So 100 cc's is what I have found, or 100 milliliters is what's going to get you pretty precisely what you need. I actually should have put this, I usually put this on a little tray. So one of the little circles that I use in another craft. And yes, there's bubbles, but I'm going to smooth this around. I tap it a little bit to make certain everything gets down in there. When you have a mold like this, you have to make sure that this mold is all the little spaces are filled in, and we have to make sure this little bump is covered. And you can see when you put the stick down in there, about 1/4 of an inch of the stick goes down, and that's what you need to see, okay? So a little bit of alcohol so that we can get these bubbles out. I'm gonna pick this up and tap. And the reason I do it on this is because once you put this resin in here, this is wobbly, you know, you don't want to spill it, mess up your mold or anything like that. So as you can see, now that's clear. That's just plain old clear resin. All right, we're gonna go put this on the drying tray, the drying table with the level, because this has to stay nice, flat, and even. Put this on the drying table, and we let this dry until tomorrow morning. I always go at least 12 hours before I mess with it. 24 hours is a full cure. And we're just gonna let these items dry a little bit. And then we will come back and finish this ashtray, and we will pour our grinder. So we have allowed the tray to dry with the epoxy. Okay, you can see how pretty and shiny that is. Nice and solid. That tray is finished. This is the Grinch tray. If you just wanted a Grinch tray, you've got it. This is the lid to the set that we also completed. Goes right on top of this jar. All right, so there's the first two components of the 4-piece set, both with the triple thick glaze and the epoxy, okay? And now we're gonna work on the other two parts, which are the grinder and the ashtray, okay? And we poured the first part of the ashtray when we poured the tray, okay? So now we have allowed this mold to set and dry. As you can see, this is clear resin in there. And what we are going to do next is, once again, to our Cricut machine, we are going to cut the Grinch face in the black, white, and yellow. I'm going to go ahead and cut it for the grinder also. Remember, we definitely need to measure how much space to cover. This is a 4-inch ashtray, so that lets you know about how much space we need in our little square on the Cricut design space. But I am not going to take this from the mold. I'm going to leave it just like this, okay? This is the clear part that we poured. I'm going to cut out the Grinch face again in vinyl to fit this 4-inch ashtray and to fit the 4-inch grinder. I'm just going to go ahead and cut that out because I'm going to need it a little bit later. And we're going to put the Grinch face on, and I'm going to mix my epoxy again, color it green, and pour the second half of this ashtray and our grinder. Now I have cut this out from my Cricut machine, and what I'm going to do, it's layered, ready to put on to this clear ashtray mold. Okay, I'm going to peel this right off of its little backing. I didn't quite get that nose very good. Make sure all of his little parts get where they need to be. Okay, try that again. Alrighty, and there's his face on my clear contact paper, just like we did on the tray and on the lid of the jar. And I'm going to place that just like this onto the ashtray mold, centering it the way I want it to look on the ashtray. And then we're going to smooth this down. And we need this to be absolutely flush with the acrylic, with the epoxy that's dried. We need this to be super tight down because we're getting ready to pour more epoxy right on top of this, okay? So you want to make certain this is down there really firm. No room for any epoxy to get underneath this vinyl or it's going to ruin your ashtray, okay? All right. So we're just going to peel this contact paper off very slowly. Okay. And there is the face on your Grinch ashtray. Now what we need to do is pour additional resin to top this off, and we're going to make that resin green. Now, unfortunately, I can't remember precisely the number of milliliters I used to top this off, so we're gonna play with some numbers when I pour, but let's get our epoxy together and finish up this ashtray. And we're also going to, with the same green that we finished the ashtray with, we're going to pour this grinder mold as well. Now, in order to get the green that matches this tray, now the paint that I use for this, as you may recall, is the Rust-Oleum 2X brand paint. I have never used spray paint in epoxy to mix it, and I'm not going to start trying to figure it out today. It might work to make your colors exactly the same. I've never tried it. I'm sticking with acrylic paint to color my epoxy, and that's what I'm going to do to color the epoxy for the grinder and for the top of the ashtray. So what I did was just kind of play with some paint colors in a cup before I started mixing them to kind of see which colors to put in to get as close to the green on my lid and tray as possible. And I got pretty close there. This is a combination of green, and this is a darker green. I don't know that that necessarily matters, but it's the green that I had, so it's what I used. Yellow and also white. And these are cheap paints from Dollar Tree, and they work just fine for me. So knowing these are the colors that I'm going to mix, I'm going to pour my epoxy, and then we're going to add paint to the epoxy for the desired color. Okay. Now, I've decided, since I can't remember precisely my measurements on this, the top portion of this ashtray and for this grinder, I'm going to do 75 milliliters of resin and 75 of hardener for a total of 150. And I'm pretty sure that's going to cover it. I don't remember this being much over 50 or 60 milliliters, and I do believe this top portion is anywhere from 10 to 20. But I'm going to pour out 150, 75 of each, just to make certain, and then we're going to turn this green. The green that I came up with, this is green, yellow, and white. Heavy on the yellow, just a touch of white, and green, okay? And this is the color that we're going to add to the ashtray and to the grinder. And you can see the greens, pretty good match there, okay? So, since I know I'm gonna have to pick this up and move it all, I'm gonna go ahead and set it on my little piece of plastic here. You can use cardboard, you can use a tray, anything, because this is going to have to move. And I'm going to pour the last 10 to 20 milliliters of this mold that's going to give us that little green rim that makes this ashtray look green, even though it is clear. Okay, so I'm gonna pour, and I have 150 milliliters of epoxy in here. I don't think I will need anything close to this, but we're gonna pour all the way to the rim. And I want to say it was 20 when I did this the first time. I just don't remember. And if I wrote it down, I don't even remember where. So here we go. So we're going to go right to the rim. I like to make certain it's right to the edge. And this table is not level. It's not level. I always do a few taps to make sure it's all filled in there. And I can't bang this really with the other mold in there. So we're definitely going to use the alcohol with this and get those bubbles going. Also, once I'm done pouring, I'll do some additional tapping with this to get these bubbles out of the bottom. Okay, but we will let this set, and let's go ahead and pour. See how that slides over? This table is definitely not level. Let's go ahead and pour the grinder with the same epoxy that we used for this ashtray, okay? Now, this grinder, we're going to leave a little bit of space on one of these sides so that we can apply this face and another coat of clear epoxy over the top. If you look closely at that grinder, it's green up until there, right on the edge, and that's a coat of clear. We're basically gonna flip the ashtray around on the grinder. We're going to do green and then layer with clear instead of clear layering with green. Okay, I put the face on this part of the grinder, so we will fill this side right to this rim, right to this edge, just enough for us to be able to put a face on with our Cricut vinyl and cover it with clear, okay? Now these molds, because they're little holes, I pour these pretty slowly, and I usually have to go back over it 2 or 3 times because it takes a second for it to all settle down in those holes. You'll see lots of bubbles coming up and popping as the epoxy gets down inside of these little holes. Now this mold is a little bit sturdier, and you can pick this up and maneuver it a little better than this ashtray mold. And we're going to need to move it around just a little bit and make certain that this resin is all the way in these little holes. I just kind of wiggle it around, and you'll see the little air bubbles start to pop up. Now this side, we're not going to fill this all the way anyways, because we're still going to put a face on and then a little layer of clear. This side, we want to fill to the rim, okay? Either way, though, we don't want bubbles. However full we're going to make this, we need it to be completely filled without air bubbles down inside of this mold. So I just kind of move my mold around a little bit and squeeze it and make certain that all those holes are filled in. When I set this on the drying table to dry, I come back and check this every couple of hours because sometimes little bubbles will appear after it's set and settled, and I have to add a little more epoxy or shake it around or maneuver it in a way to make certain that I don't end up with bubbles in the end result, because it's going to look like a little hole in your epoxy. It's going to look like a little hole in your plastic, and that's not going to look very nice. So you need to work with this for a moment and make certain that this is all the way filled even before you start worrying about the little additional little air bubbles. We want to make sure these big air bubbles that are telling us there's still air in the mold are full, and then we'll go and get the little tiny air bubbles. I'm going to add some more on this side because we've tapped out some bubbles, and we're going to fill a little bit more. I'm not going to put any more on that other side. I'm going to let it settle, and I'm going to leave space at the top for the clear epoxy. And that really can hold a little bit more. I get down level. And once I put this over on the drying table with the level, I will also be able to see if it is really truly level in this mold. And if it is not, I have additional epoxy and I will add that accordingly. Okay. Now you can see pretty distinctly that my table that I'm working on right now is not level at all. So I'm going to move this over. I'm going to make certain we got all the bubbles out. Make certain all of the holes are filled. This is a grinder. We need these little teeth to show up. And if there's no epoxy down in the holes, then you're not going to have teeth in your grinder. It's just going to be a space. So you have to make sure this green resin or whatever color resin you're using when you make a grinder for this set or any set or for any reason, you've got to make certain every little hole gets filled so that you have a complete grinder, or it doesn't even work. It's not even a grinder at that point. Okay, so I'm going to move this over to the drying table, and once this ashtray dries, we're done with it. We're going to pop it out of the mold. I'm going to show you how it looks. Once this green grinder dries, we're going to apply a Grinch face to this side and add one more coat of clear epoxy, and then the grinder will be done. You can see why this set takes me 3 days to finish. I'm going to move this over to the drying table, make sure everything's level. Once this dries, we'll come back, pop this out of the mold, put the Grinch face on, and our last coat of epoxy. I had a little bit of the green epoxy left over, and the way that I did this ashtray, I just wanted to mention that really quick, is the same way we're doing the circle Grinch ashtray. I just started with the green and ended with the clear. So I'm going to go ahead and use what's left of this. I've still got about 60 cc's in here, which means I used 90 between the top of the ashtray and that grinder. I'm going to have to kind of figure out exactly what. Now that's going to depend on your mold. I can't say for certain that your grinder mold is going to be the exact same measurements as mine, because it depends on where you get yours from. But I'm going to fill this mold with this leftover lime green, and we will add, when we add that clear coat of epoxy to the grinder after the Grinch face, we will pour enough to go ahead and finish the base of this ashtray. But this is done the same way that we do the Grinch ashtray with the face. We just don't put a face on this one. And we're going to pour the resin. I'm just using what's left. Make certain we get out all the bubbles. Use alcohol if needed. Tap it, drop it, whatever method you use for getting bubbles out of your epoxy. And then we will add the clear, which will give us an ashtray that's two-tone like this. And of course, you could use any color that you wanted, but I just thought that was kind of fun. So I just went ahead and did that with the leftovers, and we're going to put it over on the drying table. And we'll finish this up too when we do the other stuff. Now that we have let that resin that we colored green dry, we're going to need to put the face on this grinder. But I need to show you something, because this didn't turn out as perfectly as it should have. I had to pour this twice, and you can see I still have the little air bubble pockets in there. That's what happens when you don't get all of the bubbles out, okay? And let me show you this. I could have re-poured this and fixed it, but I went ahead and let it dry because I wanted you to see what happens with your mold when you don't get the air bubbles out. It literally dries with those little bubbles in them. Yes, it filled in the parts here, but as it settled on the top, there was no epoxy to fill these holes in because they were full of air. And that's how trashy your grinder's going to look if you don't get all of the bubbles out. Now this, I could actually pour a thin layer over the top of this and fix it. Just for the sake of this tutorial, I'm gonna go ahead and slap that Grinch on here anyways so that I can complete this, because every time I pour this, it takes me another day to let this dry. I'll be a week long trying to get this tutorial out to you guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and work with it the way that it is, but this would not be an acceptable grinder, honestly, with this little patch of air bubbles in there, okay? So with the vinyl that we've already cut from our Cricut machine, just like we did for the tray and for the airtight jar, we're going to apply it to the grinder. Now, we also had poured the ashtray. We did the green portion of the ashtray. You can see that Grinch right through there. So I'm gonna pull this mold apart, okay? And there's even a few bubbles on the underside of this. When you use paint and epoxy, you have to make certain that you get that mixed really well. But this is what the ashtray turns out like. You can see the clear, and then you can see the layer of green. That is what actually gives the ashtray, you see that, the green appearance, okay? There's our completed Grinch ashtray. You see that's clear and green, and that's how we get that green Grinch face, okay? Now what I'm going to do, even though this isn't so pretty, I'm gonna go ahead and layer my vinyl and apply the face to this green, and then we're gonna pour a little more clear. We're gonna top coat this over our vinyl so that we seal and protect this face. And we're also gonna finish this little mold. I wanted to show you all how to do the two-tone ashtray, even if you don't want a face on it. And it's gonna look like this, okay? So after we put this face on, we're gonna pour our clear epoxy and wrap this thing up. Okay, we've weeded our Cricut vinyl, okay? And this is what we've got. And now what I need to do is put that last clear layer here. And I'll go ahead and finish up this ashtray, which is just another layer of clear. It's going to take about 10 milliliters to finish off the top part of this and seal this vinyl face on. And I imagine this is probably going to be maybe about 30. But I'm going to pour, let's do 30 of each, 30 hardener, 30 of resin to finish this up. And we'll go ahead and pour this, and then we'll let them dry. Okay, so using the cups with the measurements, I'm going to do 30 cc's or 30 milliliters of our hardener and 30 of the resin. I actually just went over a little bit, so I'm going to actually do 35. I'm going to make sure I get it precise with the resin. And then we're going to mix. We're going to leave this clear. We're not going to need to do any paint or coloring with this. Because we're just going to leave it clear. This is the top coat. And then we will mix and pour. Okay, and we'll mix this up. All right, and now we're going to go ahead and do the final pour over this vinyl, and we'll go ahead and fill up the rest of this mold. Now, I do believe this is going to take about 10 milliliters, and all we're going to do is put a little thin layer, just enough to cover the vinyl on that Grinch and top off the mold. So I'm going to add just enough to cover, and we're definitely going to have to make certain all the bubbles are out. I'll use a little isopropyl alcohol, tapping the sides. We're not going to have to worry so much about holes on this part because that's all filled in now. That's not quite full. And of course, I'm going to put this over on my level table to set, and that's not quite full, but I will finish with this. Got my alcohol over on the other table because there's lots of bubbles in there. And then we'll go ahead and finish the pour for the bottom half of this ashtray. This is about 30 cc's of the two mixed. And like I've said before, this table is not level. This is a lot easier to maneuver with the other mold already in it, the other acrylic already in it, because it's stable now. It isn't quite so flimsy. But I'm going to need to tap this. You can see there's quite a few bubbles in there. We need to get all these bubbles out, as well as I'm going to do my alcohol sprays. I don't like to use heat on my molds because it tends to break the mold down, and then I don't get to keep it as long. So I'm going to go over to the drying table, tap these a little bit, and spray my alcohol so that we can get all the bubbles out of this. And this needs to dry once again until tomorrow, and then our set will be complete. This is the final stage, this clear coat of epoxy. So I'm going to go sit this on the drying table. We're going to let this dry. We want to tap, make sure we get all these bubbles out. put it over on the level table, wait for this to cure, and then we get to enjoy our rolling tray set. So we'll just let these dry a little bit longer. Well, actually quite a bit longer, until tomorrow. And then we're gonna pop these things right out of this mold and we will be done. All right, now here is both of the molds, okay? There's the grinder mold, and you can see my little air bubble flaw there. However, when I went ahead and put the vinyl on and poured the next top layer of clear, I made certain I got all the bubbles out of there, and that looks much better than the bottom of this is going to look. Really, I should have re-poured another layer over the top of this and gotten rid of that. But that's that. We're gonna pop this out. And here's the square one that we did, the two-tone in the same green. It's gonna turn out like this, a little bit different green. We're gonna take these out of the mold. And that is the Grinch set. Now this doesn't really, there's the mold, there's the ashtray. This doesn't really go with the set. And there's a little over pour on the edges of this that I need to pretty up. But this is what your mold, that's essentially what your mold does. That's a square ashtray mold. And then of course we did the circle ashtray mold. And then here's our grinder. Okay, we're gonna maneuver this out of its mold. Okay. Okay, there's the bottom half of the grinder. And here is the top. Okay, and you can see that little layer of clear right on there, and then the rest of it is green, which of course maintains the green appearance because it's clear. Okay, so there's your grinder. You have just the extra ashtray that I showed you how to do in the two-tone. You see you got your green and your clear there. Okay, and that was just something fun I wanted to do with the extra epoxy that I had. We have our Grinch grinder. Okay, and that's what it looks like on the inside. All right, our grinder. We have our actual Grinch ashtray, the circle ashtray. Bottom portion's green, top portion is clear. Just the opposite of this one. Okay, and then we have our tray. Got a little bit of something on there. And then we have our tray here. And we made this a little bit more in the center of the tray than we did on the original tray. You can see this is a little bit bigger version. And then we also had our little jar, our little Grinch herb jar is what this is, for you to store everything in. And that is how we put together the Grinch set. This is a concept of using pouring epoxy, using your Cricut machine and Cricut vinyl. That is how I completed this 4-piece set. Well, we've learned some awesome things that we can do with epoxy and our Cricut machine and vinyl. I hope I gave you guys some good pointers on how you can recreate that Grinch set just like I made. I also hope you got some pointers on what not to do when you're pouring epoxy and working with your Cricut machine and vinyl. I thank you so much for hanging out with me today. You can find me right here on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and on Facebook as Crafty Creates. I am on Instagram, Snapchat, and now on TikTok as Crafty of KC. Thank you so much for hanging out with me once again, and happy crafting.